Dean Rusk disagrees with you, and he was the Secretary of State at the time, but that's fine.
The communist nations have exploited the turmoil of a time of transition in an effort to extend the communist control into other areas of the world.
Thoughts on Dean Rusk and America's involvement in Vietnam? I know next to nothing about that.
Exactly. The hypocrisy of Noam Chomsky. There's a famous definition in the Gospels of the hypocrite, and the hypocrite is the person who refuses to apply to himself the standards he applies to others. By that standard, the entire commentary and discussion of the so-called war on terror is pure hypocrisy, virtually without exception. Can anybody understand that? No, they can't understand it. Noam Chomsky, Power and Terror, 2003. Noam Chomsky was the most conspicuous American intellectual to rationalize the al-Qaeda terrorist attacks on New York and Washington. The death toll, he argued, was minor compared to the list of third-world victims of the far more extreme terrorism of the United States foreign policy. Despite his calculated affront to mainstream opinion, this sentiment went down very well with Chomsky's own constituency. He has never been more popular among the academic and intellectual left than he is today. 2 books of interviews with him, published since September 11, 2001, both went straight onto the bestseller list. One of them has since been turned into a film entitled Power and Terror, now doing brisk business in the art house movie market. In March 2002, the film's director, John Junkman, accompanied his subject to the University of California, Berkeley, where a 5-day visit, Chomsky gave 5 political talks to a total audience of no fewer than 5,000 people. Meanwhile, the liberal news media around the world has sought him out for countless interviews as the most prominent intellectual opposed to the American response to the terrorist attacks. Newspaper articles routinely opened by reminding readers of his awesome intellectual status. A profile headlined, "Conscience of a Nation," in the English daily The Guardian declared, Chomsky ranks with Marx, Shakespeare, and the Bible as one of the 10 most quoted sources in the humanities, and is the only writer among them still alive. The New York Times has called him arguably the most important intellectual alive. Chomsky has used his status, originally gained in the field of linguistics, to turn himself into the leading voice of the American left. He is not merely a spokesman. His own stance has done much to structure left-wing politics over the past 40 years. Today, when actors, rock stars, and protesting students mount anti-American slogans for the cameras, they are very often expressing sentiments they have gleaned from Chomsky's voluminous output. Hence, to examine Chomsky's views is to analyze the core mindset of contemporary radicalism, especially in the variety that now holds so much sway in the academic arts communities. Chomsky has been a celebrity radical since the mid-1960s, when he made his name as an anti-Vietnam War activist. Although he lost some of his appeal in the late 1970s and 1980s by his defense of the Pol Pot regime in Cambodia, he has used September 11th to restore his reputation, indeed to surpass his former influence and stature. At 74 years of age at the time of this writing, he is today the Dion of the American and much of the world's intellectual left. He is, however, an unconventional academic radical. Over the past 30 years, the left in the humanities has been smitten by high theory, especially neo-Marxist, feminist, and postmodernist philosophy out of Germany and France. Much of this material was arcane enough in its own language, but in translation it elevated obscurantism to a badge of prestige. It inundated the humanities with relativism, both in epistemology and moral philosophy. In contrast, Chomsky has produced no substantial body of political theory of his own, nor is he a relativist. He advocates the pursuit of truth and knowledge about human affairs and promotes a simple, universal set of moral principles. Moreover, his political writings are very clear, pitched to a general rather than a specialist audience. He supports his claims not by appeals to some esoteric conceptual apparatus, but by presenting plain, apparently factual evidence. The explanation for his current appeal, therefore, needs to be sought not in recent intellectual fashions, but in the something of a longer history. Chomsky is the most prominent intellectual remnant of the New Left of the 1960s. In many ways, he epitomized the New Left in its hatred of America, a country he believed, through its policies, both at home and abroad, had descended into fascism. In his most famous book of the 60s, American Power and the New Mandarins, Chomsky said what America needed was a kind of denazification. Of all the major powers in the 60s, according to Chomsky, America was the most reprehensible. Its principles of liberal democracy were a sham. Its democracy was a 4-year dictatorship, and its economic commitment to free markets was merely a disguise for corporate power. Its foreign policy was positively evil, by any objective standard, he wrote at the time. The United States has become the most aggressive power in the world, the greatest threat to peace, to national self-determination, and to international cooperation. As an anti-war activist, Chomsky participated in some of the most publicized demonstrations, including the attempt, famously celebrated in Norman Mailer's Armies of the Night, to form a human chain around the Pentagon. Chomsky described the event as tens of thousands of young people surrounding what they believed to be the most hideous institution on this earth. This kind of anti-Americanism was common on the left at the time, but there were two things that made Chomsky stand out from the crowd. He was a scholar with a remarkable reputation, and he was in tune with the anti-authoritarianism of the student-based New Left at the time. At the time, the traditional left was still dominated by an older generation of Marxists, who were either supporters of the Communist Party or else Trotskyites opposed to Joseph Stalin and his heirs, but who still endorsed Lenin and Bolshevism. Either way, the emerging generation of radical students saw both groups as compromised by the support for the Russian Revolution and the repressive regime that had bequeathed to Eastern Europe. Chomsky was not himself a member of the student generation. In 1968, he was a 40-year-old tenured professor, but his lack of party membership or any other formal political commitment absolved him from any connection to the old left. Instead, his adherence to anarchism, or what he called libertarian socialism, did much to shape the outlook of the New Left. American Power and the New Mandarins approvingly quotes the 19th century anarchist Mikhail Bakunin, predicting that the version of socialism supported by Karl Marx would end up transferring state power not to the workers but to the elitist cadres of the Communist Party itself. Despite his anti-Bolshevism, Chomsky remained a supporter of socialist revolution. He urged that a true social revolution would transform the masses so they could take power into their own hands and run institutions themselves. His favorite real-life political model was short-lived anarchist Enclave formed in Barcelona in 1936 to 1937 during the Spanish Civil War. The 60s demanded for student power with a consequence of his brand of political thought. It allowed the New Left to persuade itself that it had invented a more pristine form of radicalism, untainted by the totalitarianism of the communist world. For all his in-principle disdain of communism, however, when it came to the real world of international politics, Chomsky turned out to endorse a fairly orthodox band of socialist revolutionaries. They included the architects of communism in Cuba, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, as well as Mao Zedong and the founder of the Chinese Communist State. Chomsky told a forum in New York in December 1967 that in China one finds many things that are really quite admirable. He believed the Chinese had gone some way to empowering the masses along lines endorsed by his own libertarian socialist principles, end quote. Quote, China is an important example of a new society in which very interesting and positive things happen at the local level, in which a good deal of collectivization and communization was really based on mass participation, and took place after a level of understanding had been reached in the peasantry that led to this next step, end quote. When he provided this endorsement of what he called Mao Zedong's relatively livable and just society, Chomsky was probably unaware he was speaking only 5 years after the end of the Great Chinese Famine of 1958 to 1962, the worst in human history. He did not know, because the full story did not come out for another 2 decades, that the very collectivization he endorsed was the principal cause of this famine, one of the greatest human catastrophes ever, with a total death toll of 30 million people. Nonetheless, if he was generally aloof from totalitarianism as the political principles proclaimed, the track record of communism in the USSR, which was then widely known to have faked its statistics of agricultural and industrial output in the 1930s, when its own population was also suffering crop failures and famines, should have left this anarchist a little more skeptical about the claims of the Russians' counterparts in China. In fact, Chomsky was well aware of the degree of violence the communist regimes had routinely directed at the people of their own countries. At the 1967 New York Forum, he acknowledged both the mass slaughter of landlords in China and the slaughter of landlords in North Vietnam that had taken place once the communists came to power. His main objective, however, was to provide a rationalization for this violence, especially that of the National Liberation Front, then trying to take control of South Vietnam. Chomsky revealed he was no pacifist. Quote, I don't accept the view that we can just condemn the NLF terror. Period. Because it was so horrible. I think that we really have to ask the questions of comparative costs, ugly as that may sound. And if we are going to take a moral position on this, and I think we should, we have to ask both what the consequences were of using terror and not using terror. If we're true that the consequences of not using terror would be that the peasantry in Vietnam would continue to live in the state of the peasantry of the Philippines, then I think the use of terror would be justified. It was not only Chomsky who was suckered into supporting the maelstrom of violence that characterized the communist takeovers in Southeast Asia. Almost the whole of the 1960s New Left followed. They opposed the American side and turned Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Cong into romantic heroes. When the Khmer Rouge took over Cambodia in 1975, both Chomsky and the New Left welcomed it. And when the news emerged of the extraordinary event that immediately followed the complete evacuation of the capital, Phnom Penh, accompanied by reports of widespread killings, Chomsky offered a rationalization similar to those he had provided for the terror in China and Vietnam. There might have been some violence, but this was understandable under conditions of regime change and social revolution. Although information was hard to come by, Chomsky suggested in an article in 1977 that post-war Cambodia was probably similar to France after liberation at the end of World War II, when thousands of enemy collaborators were massacred within a few months. This was to be expected, he said, and was a small price to pay for the positive outcome of the new government of Pol Pot. Chomsky cited a book by two American left-wing authors, Gareth Porter and George Hildebrand, who had presented a carefully documented study of the destructive American impact on Cambodia and the success of the Cambodian revolutionaries in overcoming it, giving a very favorable picture of the programs and policies. By this time, however, there were two other books published on Cambodia that took a very different line. The American authors John Barron and Anthony Paul called their work Murder of a Gentle Land and accused the Pol Pot regime of mass killings that amounted to genocide. Francis Ponachad's Cambodia Year Zero repeated the charge. Chomsky reviewed both books together in a number of press articles. In The Nation, in June 1977, he accused them of publishing little more than anti-communist propaganda. Articles in the New York Times Magazine and the Christian Science Monitor suggested that the death toll was between 1 and 2 million people out of a total population of 7.8 million. Chomsky mocked the total and picked at the sources, showing some were dubious and that a famous photograph of forced labor in Cambodian countryside was actually a fake. He dismissed the Barron and Paul book partially because it had been published by Reader's Digest and publicized on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, both of them notorious anti-communist publications, and partially because they had omitted to report the views of journalists who had been to Cambodia but not witnessed any executions. Porchard's book, however, was harder to ignore. It was based on the author's personal experience in Cambodia from 1965 until the capture of Phnom Penh, extensive interviews with refugees, and reports on Cambodian radio. Moreover, it had been favorably reviewed by left-wing authors in the New York Review of Books, a publication for which Chomsky himself had often written. Chomsky's strategy was to undermine Ponachad's book by questioning the credibility of his refugee testimony. Acknowledging that Ponachad gives a grisly account of what refugees have reported to him about the barbarity and the treatment at the hands of the Khmer Rouge, Chomsky said, "We should be wary of extreme unreliability of refugee reports." He wrote, quote, "Refugees are frightened and defenseless at the mercy of alien forces. They naturally tend to report what they believe their interlocutors wish to hear. While these reports must be considered seriously, care and caution are necessary. Specifically, refugees questioned by Westerners or Thais have a vested interest in reporting atrocities on the part of Cambodian revolutionaries, an obvious fact that no serious reporter will fail to take into account." In 1980, Chomsky expanded this critique into the book After the Cataclysm, co-authored with his longtime collaborator Edward S. Herman, substantially about Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The great majority of its content was a defense of the position Chomsky took on the Pol Pot regime. By this time, Chomsky was well aware that something terrible had happened. "The record of atrocities in Cambodia is substantial and often gruesome," he wrote. "There can be little doubt that the war was followed by an outbreak of violence, massacre, and repression." He mocked the suggestion, however, that the death toll might have reached more than 1 million, and attacked Senator George McGovern's call for military intervention to halt what McGovern called a clear case of genocide. Instead, Chomsky commended authors who apologized for the Pol Pot regime. He approvingly cited their analysis that the forced march of the population out of Phnom Penh was probably necessitated by the failure of the 1976 rice coup. If this were true, Chomsky wrote, "The evacuation of Phnom Penh, widely denounced at the time, and since for its undoubtedly brutality, may actually have saved many lives." Chomsky rejected the charge of genocide, suggesting that, quote, "The deaths in Cambodia were not the result of systematic slaughter and starvation organized by the state, but rather attributable in large measure to peasant revenge, undisciplined military units, out of government control, starvation and disease that are direct consequences of U.S. war or other such factors." After the Cataclysm also presented a much more extended critique of refugee testimony. Chomsky revealed his original 1977 source, for this had been Ben Kiernan, at the time an Australian graduate, student and apologist for the Pol Pot regime, who wrote in the Maoist-inspired Melbourne Journal of Politics. What Chomsky avoided telling his readers, however, was that well before 1980, the year after the Cataclysm was published, Kiernan himself had recanted his position. Kiernan had spent much of 1978 and 1979 interviewing 500 Cambodian refugees in camps inside Thailand. They persuaded him they were actually telling the truth. He also gained a mass of evidence from the new Vietnamese-installed regime. This led him to write a mea culpa in the Bulletin of Concerned Asian Scholars in 1979. This was a left-wing journal frequently cited by Chomsky, so he must have been aware that Kiernan wrote this. He also wrote, quote, "There can be no doubt that the evidence also points clearly to a systematic use of violence against the population by the chauvinist section of the revolutionary movement that was led by Pol Pot. Yet in After the Cataclysm, Chomsky does not acknowledge this at all. Kernan later went on to write The Pol Pot Regime, Race, Power, and Genocide under the Khmer Rouge 1975 to 1979, a book now widely regarded as the definitive analysis of one of the most appalling episodes in recorded history. In the evacuation of Phnom Penh in 1975, tens of thousands of people died. Almost the entire middle class was deliberately targeted and killed, including civil servants, teachers, intellectuals, and artists. No fewer than 68,000 Buddhist monks out of a total of 70,000 were executed. 50% of urban Chinese were murdered. Kernan argues for a total death toll between April 1975 and January 1979 of 1.67 million out of 7.89 million, or 21% of the entire population. This is proportionally the greatest mass killing ever inflicted by a government on its own population in modern times, probably in all of history. Chomsky was this regime's most prestigious and most persistent Western apologist. Even as late as 1988, when they were forced to admit in the book Manufacturing Consent that Pol Pot had committed genocide against his own people, Chomsky and Herman still insisted they had been right to reject the journalists and authors who had initially reported the story. The evidence that became available in 1979, they maintained did not retrospectively justify the reports they had criticized in 1977. They were still adamant that the United States, who they claimed started it all, bore the brunt of the blame. In short, Chomsky still refused to admit how wrong he had been over Cambodia. Chomsky has persisted with this pattern of behavior right to this day. In his response to September 11th, he claimed that no matter how appalling terrorist actions the United States had done worse, he supported his case with arguments and evidence just as empirically selective and morally duplicitous as those used to defend the Pol Pot regime. On September 12, 2001, Chomsky wrote, "The terrorist attacks were major atrocities. In scale, they may not reach the level of many others. For example, Clinton's bombing of the Sudan with no credible pretext, destroying half its pharmaceutical supplies and killing unknown numbers of people." This Sudanese incident was an American missile attack on the Al-Sharifa pharmaceutical factory in Khartoum, where the CIA suspected Iraqi scientists were manufacturing the nerve agent VX for use in chemical weapons contracted by Saddam Hussein regime. The missile was fired at night so that no workers would be there and the loss of innocent life would be minimalized. The factory was located in an industrial area, and the only apparent casualty of the time was the caretaker. While Chomsky drew criticism for making such an odious comparison, he was soon able to flesh out his case. He told a reporter from Salon.com that rather than an unknown number of deaths in Khartoum, he now had credible statistics to show there were many more Sudanese victims than those killed in New York and Washington. That's one bombing, according to estimate made by the German embassy in Sudan and Human Rights Watch, probably led to tens of thousands of deaths, he said. However, this claim was quickly rendered suspect. One of his two sources, Human Rights Watch, wrote to Salon.com the following week, denying it had produced any such figure. Its communications director said, "In fact, Human Rights Watch has conducted no research into civilian deaths as a result of U.S. bombing in Sudan and would not make such an assessment without careful and thorough research mission on the ground." End quote. Chomsky's second source had done no research into the matter either. He was Werner Dahl, German's ambassador to Sudan from 1996 to 2000, who wrote in the Harvard International Review summer 2001. Despite his occupation, Dahl's article was anything but diplomatic. It was largely an anti-American tirade criticizing the United States international human rights record, blaming America for the 1980s Iran-Iraq War, and holding it responsible for the purported deaths of 600,000 Iraqi children as a result of post-1991 economic sanctions. Nonetheless, his comments on the death toll from the Khartoum bombing were not as definitive as Chomsky intimated. Dahl wrote, quote, "It is difficult to assess how many people in this poor African country died as a result of the destruction of the Al-Sharifa factory, but several tens of thousands seem reasonable guess. The factory produced some of the basic medicines of the World Health Organization list, covering 20 to 60% of Sudan's market and 100% of the market for intravenous liquids. It took more than 3 months for these products to be replaced with imports," he writes. Oh, I guess that means 10,000 deaths immediately, right off the bat. Now, it's hard to take seriously Dahl's claim that this guess was in any way reasonable. He said there was a 3-month gap between the destruction of the factory and the time it took place to replace its products with imports. This seems an implausibly long interval to ship pharmaceuticals, but even if true, it's fanciful to suggest that several tens of thousands of people would have died in such a brief period. Had they done so, they must have succumbed to a highly visible medical crisis, a pandemic, to put SARS outbreak to the shade. Yet no one on the spot, apart from the German ambassador, seems to have ever heard of it. Anyone who makes an internet search of the reports from the Sudanese operations of several Western aid agencies, including Oxfam, Médecins Sans Frontières, and Norwegian People's Aid, who have been operating in this region for decades, will not find any evidence of an unusual increase in the death toll at the time. Instead, their major health concern, then and now, has been how the Muslim Marxist government in Khartoum was waging civil war by bombing the civilian hospitals of its Christian enemies in the south of the country. The idea that tens of thousands of Sudanese would have died within 3 months from a shortage of pharmaceuticals is implausible enough in itself. That this could have happened without any of the aid organizations noticing or complaining is simply unbelievable. Hence, Chomsky's rationalization for the September 11th attacks is every bit as deceitful as his apology for the Pol Pot regime and his misreading of the Cambodian genocide. It is the responsibility of the intellectuals to speak truth and expose lies, Chomsky wrote in a famous article in the New York Review of Books in February 1967. This was not only a well-put and memorable statement, but was also a good indication of its principal target. Most of his adult life has been spent in the critique of other intellectuals who he claims have not fulfilled their duty. The central argument of American power and the new mandarins is that the humanities and social sciences had been captured by a new breed of intellectuals. Rather than acting as Socratic freethinkers, challenging received opinion, they have betrayed their calling by becoming servants of the military-industrial state. These interests of these new Mandarin class, he argued, had turned the United States into an imperial power. Quote, the mentality of the colonial civil servant, persuaded by the benevolence of a mother country and its correctness of its vision of the world order, has convinced that he understands the true interest of the backwards peoples whose welfare he is to administer, end quote. Chomsky named the academic fields he regarded as the worst offenders: psychology, sociology, systems analysis, and political science, and held up some well-known practitioners, including Samuel Huntington of Harvard, and among the worst examples. The Vietnam War, Chomsky exclaimed, was designed and executed by the new mandarins. In itself, Chomsky's identification of the emergence of a new type of academically trained official was neither original nor radical. Similar critiques had been made of the same phenomenon in both Western and Eastern Europe for some time. Much of his critique had been anticipated in the 1940s in a book from the other end of the political spectrum. Friedrich von Hayek's book, Road to Serfdom, which identified the social engineers of the welfare state as the greatest internal threat to Western liberty. Chomsky offered a leftist version of the same idea, writing, quote, there are dangerous tendencies in the ideology of the welfare state intelligentsia who claim to possess the technique and understanding required to manage our post-industrial society and to organize the international society dominated by the American superpower. Yet at the very time he was making this critique, Chomsky himself was playing at social engineering on an even grander scale. As he indicated in his report in 1967 for the collectivization and communization of Chinese and Vietnamese agriculture, which had turned terror and mass slaughter, he had sought the calculated recognition of traditional societies. But as advocacy of revolutionary change throughout Asia, he was seeking to play a role in the reorganization of the international order as well. Hence, apart from occupying a space on the political spectrum much further to the left than the academics he criticized, and apart from his preference for bloodshed over more bureaucratic techniques, Chomsky himself was the very exemplar of the new Mandarin he purported to despise. He was, in fact, one of the more successful examples of the breed. There has now been enough analysis of the Vietnam War to demonstrate conclusively that the United States was not defeated militarily. South Vietnam was abandoned to its fate because of the war's political costs at home. The influence of radical intellectuals like Chomsky in persuading the student generation of the 1960s to oppose the war was crucial in elevating these political costs to an intolerable level. The result they helped produce, however, was far worse than any bureaucratic solution that might have emanated from the behavioral sciences of the 1960s. From our present vantage point, we can today see the long-term outcomes of the choice Chomsky posed in 1967 between the comparative costs of revolutionary terror in Vietnam versus continuation of private enterprise agriculture in the Philippines. The results all favor the latter. In 2001, the average GDP per head in the Philippines was $4,000. At the same time, 25 years of a revolution in Vietnam had produced a figure of only half as much, a mere $2,100. Even those Vietnamese who played major roles in the transformation are now dismayed at the outcome. The former Viet Cong general, Pham Xuan, and said in 1999, all that talk about liberation 20, 30 years ago, all the plotting, all the bodies producing this impoverished, broken down country led by a gang of cruel and paternalistic, half-educated theorists. These half-educated theorists were the very mandarins Chomsky and his supporters so badly wanted to succeed and worked so hard to install. As well as social science practitioners and bureaucrats, the other representatives of the intelligentsia to whom Chomsky has long been hostile are the people who work in the news media. Although his politics made him famous, Chomsky has made no substantial contribution to political theory. Almost all his political books are collections of short essays, interviews, speeches, and newspaper opinion pieces about current events. The one attempt he made at a more transmorphing analysis was the work he produced in 1988 with Edward S. Herman, Manufacturing Consent, the Political Economy of Mass Media. This book, however, has been a disappointment to his followers. Media studies is a huge field ranging from traditional defenses of the news media as the fourth estate of the democratic system to the most arcane cultural analysis produced by radical postmodernist theorists. Chomsky and Herman gave no indication they had digested any of it. Instead, the book offers a crude analysis that would have been at home in an old Marxist pamphlet from the 1930s. Apart from the introduction, most of the book is simply a rehash of the author's previously published work criticizing media coverage of events in Central America, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, and Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, plus one chapter on reporting of the 1981 KGB Bulgarian plot to kill the Pope. To explain the role of the mass media, Chomsky and Herman offer their propaganda model. This claims the function of the media is, quote, to amuse, entertain, and inform, and to inoculate individuals with the values, beliefs, and codes of behavior that will integrate them into an institutional structures of the larger society in a world of concentrated wealth and major conflicts of class interest. To fulfill this role requires systematic propaganda, end quote. This is true, they maintain, whether the media operate in liberal democracies or under totalitarian regimes. The only difference is that in communist and other authoritarian societies, it is clear to everyone that the media are instruments of the dominant elite. In capitalist societies, however, this fact is concealed since the media actively compete, periodically attack, and expose corporate and governmental malfeasance, and aggressively portray themselves as the spokesman for free speech and the general community interest. Chomsky and Herman argue that these attacks on authority are always very limited, and the claims of free speech are merely smokescreens for inoculating the economic and political agendas of the privileged groups that dominate the economy. The media, they note, are all owned by large corporations. They are beholden for their income to major national advertisers. Most news is generated by large multinational news agencies, and any newspapers or television station that steps out of line is bombarded with flack or letters, petitions, lawsuits, and speeches from pro-capitalist institutions set up for this very purpose. There are, however, two glaring omissions from their analysis: the role of journalists and the preference of media audiences. Nowhere do the authors explain how journalists and other news producers come to believe they are exercising their freedom to report the world as they see it. Chomsky and Herman simply assert these people have been duped into seeing the world through a pro-capitalist ideological lens. Nor do they attempt any analysis of why millions of ordinary people exercise their free choice every day to buy newspapers and tune into the radio and television programs. Chomsky and Herman fail to explain why readers and viewers so willingly accept the worldview of capitalist media proprietors. They provide no explanation for the tastes of media audiences. This view of both journalists and audiences are easily led ideological dupes of the powerful is not just a fantasy of Chomsky and Herman's own making. It is also a stance that reveals an arrogant and patronizing contempt for everyone who does not share their politics. The disdain is inherent in the outlook was revealed during an exchange between Chomsky and a questionnaire at a conference in 1989, reproduced in Chomsky's Understanding Power in 2002. The questionnaire says, "The only point I've seen about journalists is that they are basically narcissistic and left of center." Chomsky responds, "Look, what people call left of center doesn't mean anything. It means they're conventional liberals, and conventional liberals are very state-orientated and usually dedicated to private power." End quote. In short, Chomsky believes that only he and those who share his radical perspective have the ability to rise above the illusions that keep everyone else slaves of the system. Only he can see things as they really are. Since the European Enlightenment, a number of prominent intellectuals have presented themselves as a secular Christ-like figures, lonely beacons of light, struggling to survive in a dark and corrupting world. This is a tactic that has often delivered them followers among students and other idealistic youths in late adolescence. The phenomenon has been mostly successful when accompanied by an uncomplicated morality that his constituency can readily absorb. In his Ruminations on September 11th, Chomsky reiterated his own apparent direct and simple moral principles. Reactions to the terrorist attack, he said, should meet the most elementary moral standards. Specifically, if an action is right for us, it is right for others. And if it is wrong for others, it is wrong for us. Unfortunately, like his declaration of the responsibility of the intellectual to speak truth and to expose lies, Chomsky himself has consistently demonstrated an inability to abide by his own standards. Among his most provocative recent demands are for the American political and military leaders to be tried as war criminals. He has often couched this in terms of the failure by the United States to apply the same standards to itself as it does to its enemies. For instance, America tried and executed the remaining World War II leaders of Germany and Japan, but failed to try its own personnel for the war crime of dropping the atomic bomb on Japan. Chomsky claims the American bombing of dams during the Korean War was a huge war crime, just like racist fanaticism, but the action was praised at home. That's just a couple of years after they hanged German leaders who were going to do much less than that. The worst current example, he claims, is American support for Israel. Quote, virtually everything that Israel is doing, meaning the United States and Israel are doing, is illegal. In fact, a war crime. And many of them are defined as grave breaches, that is, serious war crimes. This means that the United States and Israel leadership should be brought to trial, end quote. Yet, Chomsky's moral perspective is completely one-sided. No matter how great the crimes of the regimes he has favored, such as China, Vietnam, and Cambodia under the communists, Chomsky has never demanded their leaders be captured and tried for war crimes. Instead, he has defended these regimes for many years to the best of his ability through the use of evidence he must have realized was selective, deceptive, and in some cases invented. In fact, had Pol Pot ever been captured and tried in a Western court, Chomsky's writings could have been cited as witnesses for the defense. Were the same to happen to Osama bin Laden, Chomsky's moral rationalizations, in his most recent book, almost any crime, a crime in the street, a war, whatever it may be, there's usually something behind it that has elements of legitimacy, could be used to plead for a lighter sentence. This kind of two-faced morality has provided a model for the worldwide protest by left-wing opponents of the American-led coalition's war against Iraq. The left was willing to tolerate the most hideous acts of state terrorism by Saddam Hussein regime, but was implacable in its hostility to intervention by Western democratic governments in the interest of both their own security and the emancipation of the Iraqi people. This is hypocrisy writ large. The long political history of this aging activist demonstrates that double standards of the same kind have been characterized his entire career. Chomsky has declared himself a liberation and anarchist, but has defended some of the most authoritarian and murderous regimes in human history. His political philosophy is purportedly based on empowering the oppressed and toiling masses, but he has contempt for ordinary people who he regards as ignorant dupes of the privileged and the powerful. He has defined the responsibility of the intellectual as a pursuit of truth and the exposure of lies, but has supported the regimes he admires by suppressing the truth and perpetrating falsehoods. He has endorsed universal moral principles, but has only applied them to Western liberal democracies while continuing to rationalize the crimes of his own political favorites. He is a mandarin who denounces mandarins. When caught out making culpable, irresponsible misjudgments, as he was over Cambodia and Sudan, he has never admitted he was wrong. Today, Chomsky's hypocrisy stands as the most revealing measure of the sorry depths to which the left-wing political activism has done so much to propagate has now sunk.
Not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could.